I'm Mehdi, Hassan, and today I'll go head-to-head with Paul Bremer, appointed by George W. Bush to run the US-led Coalition Provisional Authority in the wake of the Iraq War. I'll be asking him how personally responsible he feels for the birth of ISIL and for the hundreds of thousands of deaths in that country. There's no panel, no audience, just me and him. Paul Bremer, thanks for joining me on Head to Head. There are some who would say that the decisions you took in Iraq in 2003, after the invasion, led directly, or indirectly even, to the rise of groups like ISIL, that you're in a sense the father of ISIL. What do you say to them?
I say it's nonsense.
You say it's nonsense? Kofi Annan, the then UN Secretary General, who's one of those people, he said earlier this year, you cannot disassociate the situation in Iraq today from the US intervention of 2003 because the link is clear. Even Tony Blair, one of the Iraq invasion's most ardent defenders, listen to what he told CNN.
You can't say that those of us who removed Saddam in 2003 bear no responsibility for the situation in 2015.
Your response to Annan and Blair?
Well, I think it's important to remember that ISIS didn't come out of nowhere. It's basically Al-Qaeda in Iraq version 3. There was a terrorist group called Ansar al-Islam that was active when I got there in 2003. It was succeeded by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was defeated by the Iraqi army with American help in 2009, and now there's ISIL. Now, you could say, well, none of this would have happened if Saddam Hussein were still in power, but that's an argument for leaving Saddam Hussein in power. I don't accept that. I think Iraq is much better off without Saddam Hussein today than it would be if he were still in power. And by the way, I think American interests are better served without Saddam Hussein.
I think the argument that the critics make is not that it was simply a matter of getting rid of Saddam, and that's a different debate which we won't have on this show, but it's more about what happened after Saddam fell. The decisions you took directly led to people joining up with such resistance groups, becoming part of an insurgency. You don't accept that that had a connection. You say there's no evidence that you've seen to the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then the rise of ISIL that you see today.
Well, there's a connection between the rise of ISIL
and the rise of
Al-Qaeda,
but not between your decisions.
Al-Qaeda and Ansar al-Islam.
But not between your handling of Iraq.
I see.
Because what's interesting about your record in Iraq is it's not just left-wingers or anti-war liberals or Democrats who have criticized you. As you know, your fellow Republicans have taken shots at you as well, who supported the war. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, he described you as, quote, the largest single disaster in American foreign policy in modern times. Why would he say that?
Well, I suppose because he believes it.
But why?
I mean, he has a right to that opinion.
It's a pretty strong opinion. The largest single disaster. Not the second, not the third. You're the biggest disaster.
I've been called a lot worse that aren't on the record.
Okay.
He's entitled to his view. It's one I don't share.
Okay, well, let's get into some of the background which has produced some of those criticisms. I want to put three of the main criticisms that have been leveled at you over the past decade. Three things you did as head of the Coalition Provisional Authority that have been tied directly or indirectly to the rise of ISIL today. The so-called de-Baathification order, the disbanding of the Iraqi army, and the setting up of the Iraqi political system, some would say on sectarian lines. Let's listen to you speaking back in May 2003.
The Coalition Provisional Authority disestablished the Ba'athist Party on April 16th. Shortly, I will issue an order on measures to extirpate Ba'athist and Ba'athism from Iraq forever. We have and will aggressively move to seek to identify these people and remove them from office.
That very controversial de-Baathification decree that you issued, I think, less than a week after arriving in Iraq in May 2003, ended up purging former members of Saddam Hussein's party from public service. Tens of thousands of people, school teachers, civil servants, engineers, lost their jobs. Many of them weren't hardcore Baathists or Saddamites, but they were, of course, Sunnis, who became further marginalized in this new Iraq. Ricardo Sanchez, who was the general, the US military commander on the ground, he called your de-Baathification policy, quote, a catastrophic failure.
The de-Baathification decision was made on recommendation of the thousands of Iraqis that the State Department had consulted with before the war in the years 2001 and 2002. There was no dispute about the fact that something had to be done about the party. The de-Baathification decree that I issued was carefully drawn to affect only 1% of the Ba'ath Party, about 20,000 people. The mistake I made, and I have freely admitted it, was I said we're not going to be able to make the fine distinctions about whether Abdul joined the Ba'ath Party because he believed in its ideology, or he joined because it was the only way to get a job. I said, we're going to have to turn it over to Iraqis to make those distinctions. The mistake I made was turning it over to Iraqi politicians, who then did what you said. They then applied it to teachers and people who were not part of the
And as they were doing that, what were you
original
doing?
decree.
Just watching?
No. I pulled it back. I had to reverse the decision of the Iraqi De-Baathification Council. I worked with the Minister of Education to put 11,000 teachers who had been inappropriately affected back to work, and I took the authority back from the Iraqi politicians. What I should have done is I should have found some Iraqi judges, and there were plenty of judges who Saddam paid no attention to because he didn't use the court system. I should have put a panel of judges together who could have made those distinctions and who could have kept it from becoming a political football.
Some say you should have also listened to your own advisors who you found in Baghdad working for the US. General Jay Garner, who was the director of the Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance in Iraq when you arrived there, he said he tried to persuade you to soften the de-Baathification order, but you said to him, quote, "I'm not asking for your advice. The CIA station chief told you not to do it. He warned you, if you do this, you're going to drive 30,000 to 50,000 Baathists underground by nightfall." And you reportedly replied, "It's not open for discussion." Do you wish you'd done a little bit more discussion before you made such a controversial decree?
Matter of fact, what I did do, they were intending to issue this decree even before I got to Iraq, and I said to the Defense Department, I think I should get out there and talk to some of the other people about whether we should do this or not. That's why it came a week later.
A week? You did a week of talking for such a major move? A week's not very long, some would say.
The Ba'ath Party had already been outlawed by General Tommy Franks a month before that in the freedom message he issued on April 10th, 2003. Yes. The only question was it was clear the Ba'ath Party was going to cease to exist. It had already ceased to exist. The question was, what do we do with the members who are the top members?
Yes.
And the decree was drafted intentionally to affect only the top members, 20,000 people, is what the station chief told me, not 20 to 50 or whatever that
30 to 50,000, he didn't say.
What he said to me was 20,000, which conformed with what I had heard from the Pentagon.
So you're saying you didn't disregard their advice. The advice as they relay is not what you remember them saying to you?
Correct.
Okay. You gave a second order in May 2003, less than 2 weeks after arriving in the country, to disband and dissolve the Iraqi army. General Colin Powell, Secretary of State at the time, says he wasn't consulted on the decision to disband the army. He didn't agree with it. He said it resulted in Iraqi soldiers being left, quote, jobless and angry, prime recruits for insurgency. General David Petraeus, who you've since praised for the surge, who went on to become CIA director, he says that the order to disband the army created, quote, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of additional enemies of the coalition. And we now know that ISIL is full of ex-Iraqi army colonels, generals, majors. They seem to be vindicated in what they said.
First of all, neither Powell nor Petraeus said anything like that in 2003.
Well, you didn't tell Powell, did you? He said, I didn't know about it. Had you talked to him, he might have told you that.
My job was in Baghdad. My job was not coordinating the American government in Washington. My reporting channel to the president that he set up was through the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense was fully informed, as was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Powell was Secretary of State. He's told me since that he did not hear about it, and I've said to him, Mr. Secretary, that wasn't my job to do interagency coordination. So, fair enough. Petraeus was serving at the time in
Mosul,
and he said nothing to me of the kind that he now says afterwards. So, it's important to take the decision in terms of the consequences at the time and the background at the time. I was told explicitly by the Kurdish leaders, they got rumors that some American colonels wanted to recall the Iraqi army. Explicitly, the leaders of the Kurdish parties said, if you recall the army, we are going to secede from Iraq. The Kurdistan will have nothing to do with that. The Shia, who represent whatever, 60% of the population, were cooperating with the coalition, and they too heard these rumors that we were going to recall the army. And they said that's basically creating Saddamism without Saddam. You're going to get another colonel here.
The Shias.
The Shia. And it was clear that they also would stop cooperating with the coalition if we had recalled the army. So the idea of recalling the army politically was a disaster.
You say that the Shias were against it as well, and
Right,
yet
right.
Ali Alawi, who was Iraq's first Shia defense minister post-war, said your disbanding of the Iraqi army, quote, came as a shock to most Iraqis because it was difficult to, quote, even for the Shias to accept a wholesale dissolution of the armed forces and leave the country bereft of an army. Laith Kuba, who I'm sure you know, former advisor to the State Department, became a spokesman for the Shia-led Iraqi government. He says that your measure to dissolve the Iraqi army was not a smart one. It alienated large numbers of people.
I did not disband or destroy the Iraqi army. There was not a single member of the Iraqi army, not a single unit standing to arms on April 17th, as General Abizaid has testified himself. The question wasn't to disband. That was a mistake. We should never have used that verb. The question was, should we recall the army? And I've given you the political reasons, which to me were decisive then and continue to be decisive today, for not recalling the army. So the argument that we threw a bunch of people on the streets, first is wrong, they were already home. Secondly, that they had no income is also wrong because we paid them retirement and they were free to go out and set up businesses, they could set up newspapers. They were
in a war-torn country with a shattered economy, it wasn't exactly a free market utopia
at the time. Do you know, 3 weeks after I got to Baghdad, there were already 100 newspapers being printed in Baghdad.
Okay,
so don't talk down to the Iraqi people. They were
I'm not sure every soldier wants to become a journalist, with respect.
Maybe every soldier didn't want to be a journalist. Maybe some of them wanted to join an army against...
Not maybe, they did.
Maybe, I don't know. Not during the
evidence.
time I was there, the evidence was very thin on that. If members of the army decided they didn't want to become journalists or farmers or set up businesses, which hundreds of thousands of Iraqis did in the wake of the freedom, and if they took up arms, it wasn't because they weren't being paid or didn't have alternatives. It's because they didn't believe in the future of a democratic Iraq.
You say that at the time there was no evidence that they were going off to fight an insurgency. In your own book, you say that Sharif Ali, your negotiator with the Sunni tribes, told you in 2004 that insurgents in Bakuba were, quote, former intelligence, special security and military people who did not oppose the coalition or the Americans, but they feel left out of the political life and want to be included. That's your words in your book, Paul Bremer.
That's actually Sharif Ali's.
But you're saying no one told you at the time they were fighting. He came and told you they're fighting against you, the people you sacked.
We knew there were some of them there, but to argue that that was the motor force, and for people to say it's ISIS today, it just simply is not the case.
So Kofi Annan, David Petraeus, Colin Powell, all the experts who study ISIS, they're all wrong to say that there is a link.
Kofi Annan, who served as Secretary General while I was there, never raised this question with me. Neither did Colin Powell. Neither did David Petraeus. So
okay, so let's say they didn't raise it with you. Let's just look at hindsight. Okay, fine.
I'm not saying it. I'm saying it.
Well, let's say they didn't say it with you. You're right. You didn't get the advice you needed on that. Even now, today, though, they are now looking back in hindsight and saying, well, it was wrong. What you're doing is you're saying it's still right, even though the evidence shows that ISIL now is full of Iraqi ex-army generals, colonels,
Actually, the
majors.
evidence doesn't show that it's full of them. And
well, one study recently found 25 of the top 40 ISIL commanders are all ex-Baathists.
Well, there may be some ex-Baathists, but they are people who obviously don't believe in an independent, democratic Iraq. If you join up with ISIL, you're joining up with an ideological organization that would overthrow everything that has been established in Iraq in the last 12 years. So I have no sympathy for those guys.
I don't think there's sympathy. I think we're wondering about how we got to this situation. Just to be clear on one last thing on this army section, President Bush, when asked in 2006 by his biographer about why the decision to disband the army was taken, he replied, well, the policy was to keep the Iraq army intact. Didn't happen, Bush said.
That's right.
You went against the policy of your president, your commander-in-chief?
No, that's absolutely wrong. What he meant was, before the war, and that's been well documented, it's also in my book, before the war, they had hoped that the Iraqi army would be able to be used on reconstruction projects. That was the argument that had been made before the war. But as I said earlier, the fall of Baghdad on April 9th, there was not a single unit of the Iraqi army standing to arms anywhere in the country, according to the general in charge.
And you didn't want to recall them, as you've just told us. You didn't want to recall them.
Right.
And yet the policy of the White House was, quote, the Iraqi army be maintained as an institution because we believe that it would be dangerous to put 300,000 men on the street with guns without jobs. That was the White House policy, according to the White House guy in charge, Frank Miller of the National Security Council. Well, but you did the opposite. You put men with guns unemployed on the street.
I have no idea what Frank Miller's talking about because my guidance came from the president, didn't come from some
And the
staffer.
president told his biographer that you didn't follow his guidance.
No, you got to read the history more carefully. He's quite right. The policy had been that there might be some use for the Iraqi army after Saddam was thrown out. The fact is there was no Iraqi army afterwards. So that's all a fantasy.
Well, there's no army
Mr. Miller, whatever Mr. Miller's talking about, has nothing to do with the
There was no army
decision.
afterwards because the CIA and the US told the army during the war and before the war, go back to your homes and wait to be recalled. You then didn't recall them.
They did not say go back and wait to be recalled.
That's what
you made that up.
I made that up. Well, you should talk to Colonel John Agoglia, who worked for General Tommy Franks in Central Command.
I'd be happy to talk to any colonel who wants to
Colonel
talk.
John Agoglia says our policy was to drop pamphlets, do psychological operations, tell the Iraqi army to go home and wait for a time to be part of the new Iraq. And you're saying that that wasn't your policy. You didn't want to call them back.
It wasn't the policy of the American government. The president approved the policy on disbanding the army. The Secretary of Defense approved the policy. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved it. The general in charge of the forces on the ground in Iraq when I got there approved the order.
The Joint Chiefs say they never saw the order.
Right.
General Powell says he didn't see the order. Petraeus says he doesn't agree with the order.
General Powell did not see the order, and I understand that, and he told me that afterwards. Sometime afterwards. But that wasn't my job. That's the job of the National Security Council.
If you'd taken a little longer than 2 weeks, you might have got this right?
No, I think we've got it right.